Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Robert Siegel, who teaches at Stanford University, GSB, also the author of a couple books. The most recent one is called The Systems Leader, Mastering the Cross Pressures That Make or Break Today's Companies. And before that, you wrote The Brains and Brawn Company, and I had you on here for that a couple of years ago to talk about that book. And also, you're a venture capitalist, an investor, right? So you got a couple VC firms. So that's a lot to do. And I'm super excited that after you've been teaching for 22 years, I guess?
Yeah, and this is my 23rd year in front of the classroom.
Yeah, and now we're starting to see some books. I mean, I know you've written a lot of cases. I've used some of your cases in my classes, right? But now we've got these books. So welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be back. Wonderful to see you. And, I know that you're over on the other side of the bay. Go Bears.
Yeah, right. Okay. Right. You got to be careful when you say that walking around campus.
I consider myself twice as blessed. I think I went to the greatest public university in the world and the greatest private university in the world.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with you on both of those. And now I think this book does follow up on the Brains and Brawn Company book, but it focuses on the leadership side of things, because both in the Brains and Brawn, you kind of were bringing together two things that are thought of as opposites, right? And we normally think that there is a trade-off, right? So there's going to be some kind of frontier there, right? Where, the more brains you have, presumably the less brawns you have at some level. But you dig into 5 different trade-offs, I guess you could call them, that leaders are faced with. And, your advice is, well, you better figure out a way to do, right, both of these things simultaneously and be good at it. So I guess the question I think most of my listeners would have is, why do we need another book on leadership? I mean, I have listeners who aren't in the, managerial professions who are like, oh gosh, why does LeBlanc do so many podcasts on leadership, right? What's new under the sun? I mean, haven't we been talking about leadership since, the days of Pericles? I mean, Why do we need another book on leadership?
All right. So what we've learned over the last 8 years in this course that I've taught with Jeff Immelt, my old boss from GE, is that we started, and what came out of Brains and Brawn was this: how do you lead in a world that blends digital and physical? But as the course evolved, we saw through COVID, it really kind of became much more about crisis leadership. And even coming out of COVID, we realized that leaders were really struggling. And what we realized, and what kind of solidified for us, is we live in a world of what seems like constant crisis and increasingly rapid technological change. We see this, every day we wake up, what do we see online? And oh my goodness, how did this happen? And what's the crisis du jour? And the impression we got from leaders, large and small companies and all over the world, is, they feel like no matter what they do, they're going to get it wrong. And we've identified 5 cross pressures, as we call them. Is this idea of how do they balance certain types of things that feel like are pulling them in opposite directions. So we talk about priorities. How do you balance innovation and execution? People, how do you balance strength and empathy? Sphere of influence, looking internally and externally at a company. Geography, local and global. And then finally, we spent a bunch of time looking at purpose. How do we balance ambition and stewardship or statesmanship of our organizations? And we felt like the leaders that we were studying were really struggling with this. And so the idea was that systems leadership and being a systems leader is a framework about looking about how to address these cross pressures. And so the book articulates, here's what's different this time, and here's why everybody feels like no matter what they do, they're going to get it wrong. By the way, here are some of what I call unserious behaviors. Behaviors we see from leaders in business and in politics, like we know that's wrong, but that's what we read about all the time. And then we kind of look at about 15 to 20 leaders and companies that by any figure of merit are hugely successful. How the companies have done, how many people work for them, revenue growth, et cetera. But these aren't the people that we read about all the time in the mainstream media or on social media. And none of them are perfect. Like we look at times that they get stuff wrong. And the idea behind the book is to give readers a tool, whether they're at the C-level or vice president or director or even manager of a small team, to understand why are they feeling what they're feeling. How's a way to look at a framework and set of tools and behaviors that can address this? And then we can learn from some of the great men and women from around the world that kind of model some of the good behavior. And that's the idea behind the book.
Yeah, I used to have a colleague who said, if you want to learn how to run a railroad, go to get an MBA. And this was like in the 90s, right, at Wharton.
Uh-huh.
And, I guess you could say, if you want to learn how to run I don't know, a 1990s, software company, get an MBA now. I mean, do you think that there are certain qualities of leaders that are timeless? I mean, or is leadership is there a different type of leadership that is necessary in different time periods? I mean, if you took Lincoln and just,
Right.
Dragged and dropped him in today and put him in charge of an enterprise SaaS company, I mean, do you think it'd be any good?
It's hard to know for sure, but I guess the way I would describe it is every era that we go through has its own set of challenges and things that leaders need to do. I would argue that great leaders are adaptable to understanding the changing of the times. Now, certain things I would argue are timeless. Honesty is timeless. Intelligence is timeless. And even if we don't know something, how do we go find something out? I think the ability to deliver and execute is timeless. But how do you manage Gen Z? Lincoln wouldn't know how to deal with that unless he understood Gen Z. And a lot of this with leaders today is you've got to figure out how to, manage and lead different types of people. When I worked at Intel in the 90s, it was a really tough environment, right? It was hard charging. We called it constructive confrontation. Like Gen Z is not into constructive confrontation. And so the question that you've got to figure out as a leader is how do you hold people accountable and show strength? And at the same time, how do you also have empathy for who are they? What's been their lived experience? How do we see them and where they are and what they're going through, but also make sure they know that they have to deliver. I mean, you probably see this when you're in front of a classroom, right? We can't teach the men and women who sit in front of us today the same way we taught men and women 5 to 10 years ago. Who they are and what they've gone through is different. And so I think leadership today, in a world especially that's moving so quickly, that's where people have to be able to be more adaptable, internalize certain dualities that maybe existed separately inside of a company in the past that now need to exist inside of us internally. And so I think that things are different. The ability and willingness to adapt, I think that's constant, but what you have to adapt to depends upon the times.
Yeah. So, I mean, one possibility is that things are just different, but another possibility is that things are actually harder. I mean, I kind of got the sense from your book that you think, being a leader today is actually harder than it was in the past. Now, we don't have objective metrics. I mean, we know that it's a lot harder to win a gold medal in the 100-yard dash now than it was in the 1930s. If we took kind of like the high school kids and ran them against the gold medal winners of the 1930s, they would have creamed them.
Right.
Do we have any sense that it's just getting harder and harder to be a good leader?
I think it is. Now, let's look at Alvin Toffler. In 1970, he wrote the book Future Shock. And in that book, he defined, fast fashion, experiences, the personal computer, the move to cities. And in that book, he coined the phrase information overload. And his thesis was technology is moving so fast. We as humans don't evolve that quickly. Okay, that was 55 years ago. Look at the speed with which AI is being integrated into companies today. It's faster than what we saw with the personal computer, the mobile phone, internet, social media. And so I think it is harder when it's moving that quickly. And most leaders today are not trained to be thinking in kind of this level of speed, nor are they trained to understand what happens in different functions in an organization. In the old days, you could come up through engineering or through marketing or through manufacturing, and you would have teammates who would handle the other functions. Well, now we need to understand, what's the connection between what we do in one function versus the other function? How do we see internal and external? I think that's harder. Now, it can be done. I actually absolutely believe the men and women I talk to all over the world, they know that these things can be done. But I think getting that playbook and getting their footing is what makes it so difficult. I mean, 4 months ago, we weren't thinking that we were going to have TerraForce. Suddenly we have TerraForce. Suddenly we're seeing kind of the complete breakdown of the post-World War II economic order. And today's business leaders aren't trained to deal with a lot of these issues that are very, very nuanced in a world that has very little time for nuance.
Mm-hmm. I think you quoted Dan Leventhal, this idea of the absorptive capacity of an organization. I mean, should we be thinking about the absorptive capacity of a leader, right?
Great point. You talk about the absorptive capacity. Remember, there's two parts to that, which is a company can look outside and see what's happening outside and then can bring that information in and then make changes because of it. Well, we now have to do that as humans. And the older we get, the more senior we get, that gets harder and harder to do. We've been rewarded and promoted and we've gotten raises for doing things a certain way. Well, what happens in your mid-50s when you need to throw everything out? By the way, it's hard when you're in your 30s to throw everything out. And so what if we have to do that every 2, 3, 4, 5 years? When we use this phrase, embrace change, people love change. Greg, humans hate change. Change is uncomfortable. And I think part of this is when it is kind of constantly, we're dealing with this constant crisis and these constant disruptions, understanding that it's hard for us, it's understanding that it's hard for our customers, for the men and women who work for us, our suppliers. But the job of a leader is to step up and get their teams through it.
Right. Now, of course, there's this trade-off between explore and exploit. And Charles O'Reilly, our colleague, has talked about this quite a bit. And, that's one of the, I think, 5 pillars of this system's leadership. And I guess the idea is that, we need to be spending a lot more time exploring than we did in the past, both as leaders and as organizations, and we need to be continuously learning. How does the learning take place? I mean, you and I are both involved a lot in executive education. Yep. I mean, is executive education, do we have any evidence that it's effective? I mean, I think it's effective. You think it's effective. We have people who say, is that sort of how in my experience, I find a lot of executives, they just simply don't have the time to set aside and re-examine things and rethink things. And furthermore, if their direct reports are coming to them, they're not always going to be the ones saying, hey, you got to change things. You actually described this great story, personal story, when you were at GE, where you kind of tried to say, hey, let's move the needle here. These leaders, they don't really have time to listen to their direct reports. If they do, they're kind of skeptical of what they have to say. How important is it for them to go outside of the organization to get this learning?
I think it's critical, and if you don't do it, it will lead to failure, because otherwise it becomes too insular. Information is critical in the speed with which it's happening and the evolution of change and technology. And if we're spending all of our time inside, we don't know what's going on outside. Now, the thing that's really interesting is when we think about our labor force, education cannot keep up. K through 12 can't keep up. Cal and Stanford can't keep up. And so what you find is that companies have to constantly be scanning the horizons for knowing what's going on. And what happens oftentimes happens outside of the organization. So when a leader, and again, it can be a manager, it can be a director, all the way up to C-level, if they've got to make time in their calendar to be understanding and gathering to what's going on outside and to understanding what the implications are for the inside. That's that sphere of influence, internal and external. And then people, when it comes to something like AI, one of the things I say to leaders is, how do you use it in your everyday workflows? Even if it's just helping you draft an email, even if it's just helping you do a presentation. And especially, by the way, the first few times you do it, it's slower and it's uncomfortable, but you've got to at least understand what it's all capable of doing. And I would argue that a leader who says, I don't have time for this, they're probably spending time on the wrong issues. Where we spent time in the past isn't where we need to spend time in the future. And so making some time to invest in oneself, reading, finding trusted partners outside of the company who you can talk to and learn from. And by the way, those people can be your peers. They can be people who are older. They can even be people who are younger. I spend a lot of time asking my students, how do you use AI in your schoolwork and why? Where is it helpful? Where is it not helpful? That's all part of my learning. And I would say that leaders of companies today need to kind of ask themselves, I go back to a Katrina Lake. She's one of the founders of Stitchfix, and she had this great line. She would ask her direct reports, if you were hiring for your job today, would you hire yourself?
Right. No,
and
you don't
you're not going to do it, and exactly, and I say that and the whole room goes, ooh, you hear everybody kind of breathe deeply. And that's actually something that's on us as individuals to make sure we're investing in ourselves. Is it 2 hours a week? Is it 3 hours a week? Okay, fine, 2 to 3 hours. This is one of these things where it's up to us to make sure that we own our calendars and are spending time on the most important things, not necessarily the urgent things.
Right. Now, look, companies used to spend a lot of time trying to grow and develop their leaders internally, right? So at GE, right, they had Crotonville, and
Yep.
I interviewed Bill Conity a couple episodes ago about, and he was, very wistful about, Crotonville. I mean, companies don't do that anymore. They don't kind of invest in leadership development in the same ways as they did in the past. It's kind of like you need to figure it out, and if you can't, then you're not going to survive, right?
Well, but I've seen a lot. Yes, we see like Crotonville got sold off, and we've seen, I think it was Boeing also recently sold off their executive education center. But I guess I would push back and say, even if companies aren't developing or having and owning their own education centers, some do, but some don't, a lot of them will continue to invest in their people. And you can do that by offering online courses. You can do that by sending them to, universities around the world. And again, even some of it can be online. So I think companies who spend money on it, I write about this in the book. I spent a lot of time with TELUS, the large Canadian telecommunications company, who also does healthcare and a bunch of other things. They are very active every year in training their top 250 people in education stuff, and then cascading those lessons down to the next 1,000+ people in the organization. And it's a constant investment. And so I think companies are going to look at, there's this notion that learning is the new pension. Heather McGowan
Yeah,
came up
I
with
like that. I love that quote.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
And so it's like the question is you're going to invest in your people. Some of them will leave, but a lot of them will stay, and learning is going to help people, stay there. Amazon has announced they've invested over $1 billion in retraining their people on AI. I guarantee you there's nothing selfless about Amazon. They're not doing it for the good of the planet and the good for the world. They're doing it because it's good business. And I argue leaders that need to be thinking about how they're retraining their labor force. And I would also argue we need to be holding up a mirror and say, are we doing it for ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the combination of the rapidly changing universe in which we operate, but also with the introduction of things like AI, that becoming too specialized might be a burden, right? And that one needs to maybe wear one's expertise lightly because it's going to be stale relatively quickly. Is there some kind of superpower associated with being a generalist? I mean, I'm getting the sense from the word systems, right? Because you talk about how it comes out of systems thinking,
Yep.
and that's sort of about overcoming silos. It's
Yep.
about understanding all the different spillover effects and so forth. I mean, is there an optimal amount of specialization that one ought to have?
I think especially early in our careers, we need to develop some competency in a particular function, right? That's how we end up moving up. I would argue, though, that in today's world, other than when you and I were growing up in business, much earlier, we have to understand how what we do is impacted by other parts of a company or even outside of a company. And so, yeah, we do need to have some competency. We can't be a mile wide and an inch deep, but we do need to understand action and reaction. It's funny, if I go back in my working career, probably the things that I was best at were strategy and product. Like those were things that I understood the best. Strangely enough, in my time as a venture capitalist and now teaching finance, I've gotten pretty good at understanding issues around very, very complex financial issues, especially as companies in my startup scaled and I sit on boards and the companies are now multi-billion-dollar companies. And so I think I've had to learn to adapt and build new muscles and new capabilities. I think if our career is long, at various points we get good at certain knowledge at certain time and we add that in. I would argue that it's additive. We don't want to only be constrained by what we've done in the past, but we can be informed by it. History may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so the question is how do we constantly kind of keep learning new things? I would argue if somebody becomes too specialized, that's when you really put yourself at risk. Let's look at STEM and coding today. I was literally on a call earlier today. One of my former students is a VC, and basically with AI today, they can have as VCs, they're funding non-technical single founder companies, which you never would have done even 5 years ago, because AI is enabling that to happen. And so, look at how hard it's going to be for certain software engineers to be able to, that it was like conventional wisdom. You do that, you're going to have a job for life that's highly paid. And in 2 years, it goes away. So I think being too specialized runs that risk of quick obsolescence.
Yeah, I mean, it changes how you teach. I mean, I just finished this course called AI Strategy,
Uh-huh.
and we had all the students building out these agents, right, to take over all
Yep.
these functions. And none of them had any, well, a couple of them did, but most of them didn't have any coding
Yep.
background at all. And by the end of 7 weeks, they have these, agents. They're fully functioning and they're showing demos and stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, they've gotten better at this than me.
Yeah.
Like,
And vibe coding's a thing, right?
yeah.
Now, let me give you the other side of that. I just graded 82 papers. I was on a flight to and from the Middle East in the last week. Lots of time to grade papers.
Yeah, I'm flying out tomorrow and I got a huge stack of things with me.
And so as I'm reading these papers, it's very interesting. Even the same course that I've taught for the last 8 years, and I was comparing it to last year's papers. The prevalence of AI was overwhelming. And what I say to my students is, I give them a prompt that really the AI can't answer for them.
Right.
But what I say is, use it to help make your writing better. That's fine. And if you use it, disclose it. And I want to know what your prompts were. The students all disclosed it. But what I could tell was, versus previous years, the bottom part of the curve of 82 papers had come up. Like, I had very few horrible papers. The mean had come down. That I found that there was very little original insight. The writing was very undifferentiated. And that was an aha for me. It wasn't that it was bad, but like the words that were used, the language that was used was very pedantic.
Yeah.
And
lots
very
of bullet points too.
Yeah,
Just
and very blah.
Yeah.
And so the thing that, what I try to say to people is, like, they've got to learn how to, you talk about teaching differently. I teach them differently. I'm not going to fight them using AI. They're going to use it anyways. I kind of ask myself two questions. Given that they're going to use it, can I teach it and use it in a way where they actually, can make it them better? But secondly, I also ask them a lot, let's talk about mastery of the material. So I've got a class called Financial Management for Entrepreneurs. We've got some problem sets, and the AI models have gotten pretty good at solving our problem sets. A year ago, they weren't. Today, they're pretty good at it. And so my question with the students is, let's have the discussion of, I just want to make sure you learn. And so if you've got a tool, let's think of this as a calculator. I don't want it just to be a shortcut. And so a lot of times I'll enroll the students in that process, and I learn from them. And then, I ask them, if you were me, how would you test mastery of the material? Because they do want to know the answers and understand the why, not just the what.
Yeah, and you have your foot in academia, but also in consulting, in executive education, and also, as an investor. And I mean, if you go back 50 years ago, you probably wouldn't have seen someone with the profile that you have at most business schools. And in fact, still at plenty of business schools, there seems to be this sort of divide between the research academics and the practitioners like yourself. Of course, there's Jeff Immelt, who is, he's really a practitioner who occasionally teaches. You're someone who is at the heart of the educational experience, but you have all of these other things. It seems like that allows you to do things on the education side that you would never be able to do. What's the optimal mix there at a business school?
So if I look at my lived experience, right, I worked in large companies and small companies. I was an entrepreneur. I've been an investor, and I've now been teaching for 20 some odd years. And so hopefully each one of those things informs and teaches me, and I'm better at the other because I learned and understood. And so the first thing I would say is that we become a product of, what we've been able to go through. I think when I think about the GSB, when I was a student here more than 30 years ago, the practitioner tenure line model was best exemplified by two of my mentors, Robert Burgelman and Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. And you looked at that model. Robert is one of the world's foremost thinkers ever in strategy, especially in tech companies, and Andy Grove was Andy Grove. But people forget Andy Grove had a PhD in physics, right? Andy, a huge brain who loved academics. And the gentleman who was the dean of the business school at the time, first of academic affairs and then became the dean of the GSB, was a gentleman named Garth Saloner. And Garth really doubled down on this notion of, let's find the dual teaching model of practitioner and tenure line, where we have the academic foundation. We have a practitioner who talks about how it's applied in the real world, and you see a mutual respect on both sides. I think in the classroom, that's the best model. And I think at Stanford, we try to find that balance. It's become even harder as, to some extent, there's stuff in the curriculum. I know at places like Cal and Stanford and HBS, Yale, et cetera, where now as we teach a lot of the softer skills that I did not have around EQ and empathy and leadership. And by the way, that's not something that the tenure line historically have really done research on. And so now you've got this balance of how do you have rigor in the classroom and also a holistic set of curriculum and content. I've been lucky in the 10 courses I've co-taught at the GSB. Next year, I'll be doing my 10th course. I co-taught with 6 tenure line and 6 non-tenure line co-teachers. And I really like the model of both. And when I teach with Jeff, I get to learn from Jeff Immelt. But when I teach with my
so when you teach with Jeff, you're the academic. But when you teach the academic, you're the practitioner, right?
The academics would look at me and say, "There's no way you're an academic, right?" Because I'm a lecturer. But yes, I'm the one who's been here and really brings an appreciation and knowledge of the academic foundation. When I'm with the academics, I try to say to the students, okay, here's what my teammate is saying up here. Let me share with you how I used it last week. And talk about I was on a board meeting, and as the chairman of the nomination and compensation committee, we had to have a discussion about weighted average cost of capital, which you think you're never going to use. But by the way, we did use it on this particular company, and it dealt with the long-term incentive compensation for 6,000 employees. Similarly, when I'm with someone like Jeff has a lived experience of running a humongous company and through those ups and downs. My job is to make sure that he has the space to teach his lessons, but also to try to provide a little bit of the foundation, assign some of the academic readings, and try to connect what Jeff is teaching us with some of the Socratic method of using cases, and also to kind of the foundational ideas that we're trying to embed. I think we're at our best as Stanford and as business schools when you bring kind of here's the current relevancy with the discipline and the understanding of a tenure line faculty member. And I think co-teaching with 2 lecturers can be good when, by the way, they're bringing different skill sets. So I'll be doing a new course next year on doing business in the Middle East, and I'll be co-teaching it with a Stanford PhD in electrical engineering. He's an alum who's a member of the national government of Saudi, right? And we're going to bring a very, very different lived experience and very different world points of view about doing business there. And that works because, he and I are so different, but we're very close friends and have been for many, many years. So I think when it's complementary, that's when it really works. And then co-teaching, you learn to dance. You learn to dance with your co-teacher. And you learn how to not step in each other's toes. But when it really works, it's awesome, right? It's just, it can be really insightful and really flow.
Well, it's obvious why, as an instructor, you're going to benefit from having a toe in the real world, right, out there doing stuff. But what do practitioners get from coming back as teachers, right? I mean, I always like to say, if you can't teach it, you might not really know it, to some degree. I mean, how does teaching help them? And should we be thinking about doing more of that? If we are practitioners, kind of going back and participating as teachers, as lecturers, as instructors, as coaches, mentors, and so forth.
Different instructors and lecturers do it for various reasons. I can tell you what I think is the wrong reason is when someone says to me, "Rob, I want to be a lecturer." I'm like, "Awesome, tell me more." And they say, "I want to give back." Like, there's no giving back. Yeah. This is a hard job. Right. And by the way, you're going to work way harder than the students do. And for me, teaching is a few things. I have a platform where I can learn new things and teach myself new things. And if I can get good at it, I can teach it to other people. And so it's a way for me to stay fresh. Like, I shut classes generally when they're at their peak, when they're at their height, because, I want to not get stale. I don't want to be that person teaching the same case the same way 5 years later. And so I have this license to go learn new things and hopefully grow myself. The second part of that is when you can translate it into helping the men and women who are sitting in front of you. How can they take that knowledge? How can they learn to think so that they can be the best versions of themselves? And so I think teaching is one where it allows us to stay fresh. It allows me to stay around young people. And I think it also allows us to help grow and develop others. I happen to find that very rewarding emotionally. And by the way, that doesn't mean I'm always easy on them. In fact, sometimes I'm known for not being easy on the students. But that's kind of, I think, my role in front of the classroom is to push them into defending their points of view. Like, we're safe in a classroom. When they get out and back into the commercial world, they're going to have a point of view in a meeting and know how to defend it. And when, like, the tough issues, right? The tough issues are one where not everyone in the room is going to agree. And how do you make sure that you've thought through what you're saying, and then sometimes when, like, it gets heated, how do you kind of do that? I try to do that in a safe environment in the classroom, but give them the muscles and give them the ability to kind of develop those capabilities so they can be effective when they go back to the commercial world.
Yeah, I'm like that. I mean, if I want to learn about option pricing, I go sign up to teach a course on option pricing, and then I need to figure it out.
Right, exactly.
I got to know more about it than everybody else and stay one step ahead. Now, but look, you talk about this idea of statesmanship, okay? And I mean, this is one of the various cross pressures that you talk about, and you say statesmanship is kind of underappreciated, underdeveloped, right?
Yeah.
Maybe in short supply. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about statesmanship?
All right, let me talk about how I came up with this and why it became something that was really kind of something that I started spending a lot of time thinking about. I think we see a lot of unserious behavior in a serious world. Like, we see this today. Like, do you remember when Zuck and Elon Musk were going to fight in a cage match? Right. And it's kind of one of these things where everybody I talked to had two thoughts. Number one, I'm going to watch it. And number two, this is wrong. Okay. Why are our two most successful business leaders doing that crap? And then when we see taunting, right? AOC tweeted out one time, if Republicans are sexually frustrated that they can't sleep with me, they shouldn't take it out on my personal life. And I remember reading that and kind of going, yeah, I couldn't imagine Indira Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher, or Golda Meir tweeting that out. And then we look at someone like Sam Bankman-Fried, right? His sloppiness, going to VC meetings and playing video games. It's like, we know those are unserious behaviors. And we see things like, when you're replacing, outrageousness, you're replacing decorum with outrageousness. You see people focusing on trivial goals. You see people acting with disdain for customers. Like, we know those things are wrong. And then, let's back up a little bit. We know this idea that, we know certain leaders, when they walk into a room, we all sit up a little bit straighter. Like, we know that the men and women who do that, they kind of hold us to a higher standard, and they hold themselves to a higher standard. And I started thinking about that. And one of my colleagues at Stanford here, William Damon, who is an expert on purpose, came up with this great quote and definition of purpose. It's, an active commitment to accomplish aims that are both meaningful to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self. And I love that because, for example, people are allowed to be ambitious and leaders are allowed to be ambitious, but how do we simultaneously act as a statesman or a stateswoman or a steward of our organization? And the leaders we studied, I saw just some amazing examples of this in my class. I got asked by somebody, what do I think of as a systems leader, and what does it mean to have that statesmanship? All right, they've got a gravitas of personality and purpose. They have an intelligence and wisdom about the seriousness of the times. They're dependable in volatile situations. They bring a moral guidance without hectoring and lecturing others. They drive change beyond the self, which gets to that Bill Damon definition of purpose, and they show up on time and ready to go. And so, I saw certain leaders that really exemplified this. So like Jim Fish, who is the CEO of Waste Management. He came up as the CFO and then became the CEO. And, he's very, very financially driven, but he really shows his humanity to his people. He has this thing called fish food for thought, and he sends it out, to the employees, all the time, once a month, about kind of what's going on through his head. And he's very transparent about who he is. Like, the three things for who he is, he says to people: his faith, his family, and his job. And he doesn't proselytize, but that kind of allows people to understand who he is. There was a school shooting right by their headquarters. And when he wrote to his employee base, he didn't write about how bad guns are or gun control. He just talked about how he was hurting as a father. And that's what he was feeling inside. He kind of showed that. Aaron Levy at Box, who's, couldn't be more different than Jim Fish. Aaron, secular Silicon Valley, one of the great young leaders, who I co-taught with him in Industrialist Dilemma for 4 years. Aaron talks a lot about whether he chooses to speak up or not on issues. And his attitude is, okay, we're not as a company going to speak up on external issues unless it's like impacts 100% of our company or close to 100%. But when we do have controversial issues outside, we're going to make sure that our teammates inside have all the resources they need to make sure that they're supported. He also will challenge, conventional wisdom on issues like, for example, work from home. He's always been very clear, which is like, look, we at Box, we're an enterprise software company. If a customer calls us at 10:30 at Saturday night, we answer the phone. And people talk about work-life balance. He's like, this is who we are. And if this isn't a good fit for you, I'm not going to try and talk you into staying if who we are isn't a good fit for you. Let me help you find a job somewhere else. I love the line, by the way, back to Jim Fish. He was asking, whose brand is it anyways? Like, he doesn't believe the waste management brand is his. It's the employees. Kathy Mazzarella, who's the CEO of Graybar, she had this great line, leadership's about everybody but you. And so I think this notion of statesmanship or stateswomanship or stewardship it doesn't deny the ambition that we have as leaders. It doesn't deny who we want to be and what we hope to accomplish, but it's also about looking about everybody beyond us. And we have to lead men and women who agree with us and disagree with us. And we have to lead men and women with whom we agree and disagree. Like, we don't get to choose who we lead, Greg. Like, we have to lead everybody. And if we've got to get them from here to here, to me, that's what leadership is right now. And I don't think we're seeing this with a lot of the people who are put up there constantly in the mainstream media or on social media. But in the book, I've got 15 to 20 leaders, all of whom are successful. And we can look at them and say, well, if they can do it, so can I.
So if we don't see enough of this, is that because we don't have the right incentive systems? People are rewarded for being, obnoxious, and they're not rewarded adequately for being statesmanlike? Or is it that they simply haven't had the training? Or is it that they don't have the pressure coming from their peers, right? The norms have broken down. I mean, what is it that drives someone to want to be statesman-like? Is it, success, financial interest, the respect of their peers, right? What is it?
I think it's a confluence of variables, Greg. So like, for example, you hit on things, the reward systems for media today. Likes, shares, and by the way, even the process of, you don't just write a book, you write and sell a book. All of the things that we have to do, who we put out, we are on LinkedIn, what we do on podcasts and everything else, and we got to get it out. We get rewarded. And by the way, to break through the noise, the more outrageous we are, the more we break through the noise.
I was going to ask you, can you say some things that are a little bit more provocative for me here?
Well, it's like, okay, if I want to be more provocative, I'd say you don't need to be those assholes. Right? It's like, you don't need, and by that's the whole point of the book. I think, the book, I want to show readers that there is a path where you can be both successful, and here are leaders who are doing that, but also I believe that they can choose. Now, why aren't leaders doing that today? I don't know. I think in particular how media has changed and the business model of media, the same leaders get put up over and over and over again. We see it in politics, with gerrymandering in the United States, where we don't get moderates, and so the more extreme you can be, the more attention you get, you can raise more money. But yet at the same time, look at the men and women I have in the book, young and old, from all over the world, who are not those people and yet are hugely successful. So the question that I put to people is, why would you want to be those other people? You don't have to be that way. Robert Sapolsky here at Stanford wrote a book called Determined, A Life Without Free Will. And his thesis is that we are basically a series of cells in biological evolution that determine everything about us. Great book, a really good book. I couldn't disagree with him more. And my example of this to him is that he says that I fell in love with Debbie, my wife of 30 years, because I like how she smells, right? That's basically a biological reaction. And I want to be clear, Greg, I do love how my wife smells. With 30 years of marriage and all the ups and downs that come with that, and launching 3 children, that's a little bit more than my loving how she smells. And I believe it's because you make a commitment in a relationship to do the hard work, through good days and bad days, and good months and bad months, and good years and bad years. And business is the same way. We can be exactly the leaders that we want to be. We can be harsh, we can be kind, we can be thoughtful, we can be outrageous, but it's a choice we make. And so I think people choose to be how they want to be. And they can accept and choose to say, I want to be bombastic like the people that we've talked about earlier, or they can choose to say, I want to be like the people I see in the book. And here are successful paths on it. What I will say being a leader today is hard. It's very hard. And so hopefully we give people some frameworks and some tools that they can understand in this craziness of the world. Here are some specific things that you can do that will give you a chance. I'm not going to promise it's going to be easy. I'm not going to promise if you do these 5 things, everything's going to be fine. I don't have that listicle. But what I can say, here's a way of thinking, and you can choose to be a leader exactly how you want to be.
Now, if you want to become a good leader, I mean, what's the best path? I mean, it seems like, I don't know, having a mentor who's a good leader is going to be very powerful. Surrounding yourself with good leaders is going to,
Yep.
I mean, because, I mean, yes, there are books like yours that are helpful, but this seems like something that is difficult to paint by numbers. Right.
Yeah.
It seems like a something that you actually need experience at. You talk about thinking like a product manager. I mean, it seems like, seeking out those kinds of roles,
Yep.
which will force you
Yep.
to, be good at this practical wisdom is one way to do it. Right. I mean, should you be seeking out the kind of jobs that if you don't have these things, you're not going to succeed, and that'll force you to figure it out?
I think it would be the height of arrogance for me to say to somebody, if you don't do these things, you won't succeed.
Right.
I think there's no single path to success and no single path to failure. However, there are behaviors that we've been able to study and learn. I think great systems leaders do 4 things. You mentioned one of them, think like a product manager. The product manager's mindset is you've got to know what customers want. You've got to know how a product gets built, and you've got to know what the go-to-market momentum is. And great product managers, I like to joke, they're responsible for everything and they own nothing. And you've got to be able to get people to work together. And having that product manager's mindset is a great thing in a systems world. You've got to be able to operate at intersections. We talked about that duality of understanding things like platform and customization, understanding hardware and software. You need to be good at managing context, like how do we help people understand things, being a good communicator. And then finally, you have to have the attitude of running towards the disruption. And even though we hate disruption because change is really tough, it's really a difficult thing for us. With this kind of constant disruption, I don't know what's on the other side, but I know it won't be what came before. And so it's like one of those things where we have to sit back and say, you've got to run towards the disruption, because trying to kind of hold on to the present, you will fail. If you run into the disruption and you try a few things, you've at least got a chance of succeeding. And then with that, if you do those 4 behaviors, some of the things specifically that people can do, I like to talk about people doing the hard jobs themselves, whether it's like you're laying people off, or you've got to come in on a Saturday morning to get a product out the door and do the shipping. Don't just be the senior leader who lets your other team do it. Like, you got to be there. I talk about being brave enough to say, I don't know. Like, great systems leaders don't have all the answers. In fact, it probably starts with the humbleness of knowing what they don't know, but they will go out and find the answer and work with their team to help figure it out. They listen to people who are trusted both inside and outside the company, what we talked about earlier. They're very careful about where they spend their time. Very careful about that, because you have to watch where you spend your time. It's a signal to everybody else as to what you think is important. So as we talked about earlier, this notion of I don't have time to go get myself trained, that's a sign that you're not going to invest in yourself. And then lastly, being mindful of the difference between skill and luck. Like, there are times in our careers where we were the right person with the right skills at the right time. And then there are times in our careers when we were just lucky. And by the way, given a choice, I choose luck over skill every time. But if we're playing the playbook from a time we were lucky, we have no idea if that's the right playbook. It's just we were lucky. And so I think that those are an example of kind of both the sets of mindsets and the sets of specific behaviors that will give people a chance to lead in this very volatile world. But nothing I said there, Craig, is so hard that people can't do it. It's more of a choice that people make, and it's a mindset. I would argue that the commitment to trying to improve ourselves and become a better leaders is even perhaps more important than talent itself.
Well, I think you left out one thing, which was the first one, which is know thyself, right?
Yes.
I think you made that. That's sort of the first one you have to kind of dig into. But I mean, I want to get back to sort of how leaders are developed, because in our courses, for instance, oftentimes we will use case studies.
Yep.
And so rather than spelling things out, we kind of want people to discover these things themselves. I mean, look, you've spelled out a lot of this stuff in the book, but do you think that just spelling it out is as effective as kind of forcing people to discover it in some way? I mean, how, because you've written a gazillion cases, and the case method is, I think, becoming more and more scarce in business
Yep.
schools. It's kind of being squeezed out. There's
Yep.
not a lot of schools that still do it. And a lot of people are like, oh, it just takes too much time. It's too difficult and so forth. What is it about the case method that helps people to learn in a slightly different way?
So I teach cases differently than how I was taught how to teach cases, and it evolved over time. Before I get there, what I would say is that you're right. And again, this gets back to the new generation. You've got to teach them differently. So all of my courses have a combination of lectures, cases, and experiential learning, where either it's in the classroom where we're doing something together on an assignment. It could be an assignment I make them take home and then we come back in class and do it together. Or it could be, by the way, if they're writing a paper, it's going to be experiential based. I'm going to make it very applied, but I'm going to connect it to the readings and the lectures and the classes. And so I think that in today's classes, you need to kind of come up with new ways of blending different ways to get your message across. By the way, that also makes classes more interesting for the students. Now, how I teach cases is differently than when I was a student, before Fire on the Wheel. In those days, a tenured faculty member would stand in front of the room and cold call somebody for about 25 to 30 minutes and pull all the case facts out to prove that you had done the reading.
Right.
And then you would get into like some of the more interesting questions. The way I teach cases today is I put the case facts up on the board and I say, look, this is what was in the case. I'm assuming you read it. If nothing else, it's a refresher. And then I get right into the hard questions. And what I do and when I teach it is I try to go to the students and no matter what they say, I've got 2 or 3 follow-up questions. And one of the things that I say to the students at the start is, whatever I'm asking you about, you don't know that that's what I really think. I'm just trying to kind of, for the sake of the pedagogy, push our thinking and making sure we tighten our thinking. I say also, every question I'm going to ask you is going to be 5149. The easy decisions get made lower down in the organization. The hard ones come to you. And if the classmates disagree, I immediately get them talking to each other. It's like, no, don't tell me that. You think they're wrong. Tell this person that, which is kind of fun watching our students, especially at Stanford, where they don't like to disagree with each other. And I kind of force them to defend their points of view. And what I say to the students is, when I'm pushing you, number one, I'm not trying to make anybody look stupid, because these are hard issues. Secondly, they're going to get into a meeting room when they leave us and they go back to the commercial world, and not everyone's going to agree, and they're going to have to defend their point of view. And part of what I want them to do is to learn how to do that in that context where they're going to have to do that, in the working world. And how do they do it in a way that's effective and inclusive, but also how do they, stand up for their convictions? So I don't teach cases exclusively. I bring in other ways of teaching in my courses, and I also teach cases differently. But I think the key thing for a case is it gives a set of situations that we can analyze with the frameworks. And so therefore we can ask the hard questions. In the last class I had on systems leadership this year, we had Stella Li from BYD, the great large Chinese automotive company. She's the CEO of the Americas. She's an executive vice president at BYD. And we were asking questions of who wins, the EV battle and why? How do they think about going into other markets? And how do they think about, competing for Europe and the US? How do they think about issues of security? And I went right at all of these questions, and I forced the students to actually wrestle with them, with her sitting right there. And I think that also creates an interesting dynamic of we can't just kind of fall back into the easy way of doing things. Really good cases, I believe, kind of we start to unpack that it's complicated. Now, in business school, you've got some foundation learning that we have to learn. You've got to make sure people understand what weighted average cost of capital is, so we can have some discussion on that. But then let's talk about the weaknesses of it, and how does it compare to other ways to value a company? How's that tied into venture capital? All of these things, and you can use cases to kind of elucidate and kind of pull out kind of examples of the harder issues we're trying to get around. And then in the end, what are the 3 or 4 things we want to take away? So I don't think the case method teaching is dead. I just think that the case method teaching needs to evolve, and it's one of the tools that we have. I still think it can be hugely effective, but there's so many ways to teach now, and so many ways for us to try to get information across, and also to prove mastery of the material by the students.
So it would have been a cool exercise for you to ask the students to each write their version of this book and see if they extracted all of the insights, right, that you have in the book. And I'm guessing now that you've written the book, you can kind of flush the course and come up with the next course.
Actually, it's funny you say that. We actually shut down the course this year. Stella was the last guest ever, and there are a variety of reasons for that. Again, it's something we talked about earlier. That course, I think the last 3 years in particular, we really got it right. Go out on top. It's like Jim Brown, the old Cleveland Browns,
yeah.
are running back. Go out, Barry Sanders. Those are American football analogies. You go out on the top before you start to decline, But the idea behind systems leadership, that's got legs. And being a systems leader, I still work with a lot of companies on this. I still teach it in executive education. But when I take it out of the MBA program, now I've freed up time to do research on new things and to come up with something new to teach.
Now, look, you do a lot of work in multiple cultures. I mean, one of the things you talk about is the importance of being both local and global. And it seems like, the organizational structure in different countries is very, very different. And so the leadership skills that you need in these different environments is going to be very different. How translatable are the principles that you describe across industries and across geographies? How much adaptation do you think these skills have to make when you move to these radically different environments?
So I'll break that into two parts. I've taught systems leadership and being a systems leader basically on every continent except for Antarctica. And I know that it resonates everywhere because what I find from companies, large and small in those places, they feel the cross pressures, they feel the speed of change, and they feel the challenges that come with trying to lead in today's world. Now, you're exactly right. The context in each of those areas are slightly different. So I try to talk to them about how to adapt it to what they're going through. But let's kind of expand for a second. Globalization right now is a challenging thing, right? We see this in politics and what's going out. But, let's face it, Greg, companies are still going to be crossing borders with customers and supply chains. Communication and collaboration tools are not slowing down. And so while it might be that it used to be people who ran large multinationals were the ones who dealt with local and global, I'm going to argue that even small companies today cross borders because their customers might be anywhere. Their suppliers might be anywhere. There's a lot of stuff that goes in with that. And so I think what has to happen is you as a leader need to understand what's happening in particular regions. I tell a story in the book where I started at 8 o'clock one day teaching online to a group of people in Oman. I was in my home studio, my home television studio, which used to be my home office. And then I came to campus and taught a class of MBAs, had lunch with some colleagues on the faculty, met with some students, went home at 5 o'clock, got back online, did a whole bunch of, training of some entrepreneurs in South Korea, had dinner with my wife, and then at 10 o'clock got back on Zoom and taught a bunch of executives in Malaysia. So there's one dude, 1 day, 4 continents. Yeah. And that's, I think, more normal. And I'm nobody. I'm nobody. And so if that's the case, we can imagine that leaders are going to be crossing those borders. And it's important, I think, for leaders to understand contextually what's happening to the people in the other locations. And I think that's actually one of the things that's a real opportunity. So when people are good at it, they're going to understand what's happening in different contexts in different parts of the world and how they have to might lead differently in their own region, but then understand what's happening in a different region. So I think a lot of the cross pressures are the same. What I would say that the differentiator for leaders, again, can be manager, director, vice president, C-level, is that ability to say, okay, I understand what's happening here. I understand the displacement of labor and capital that came from globalization 1.0 is what led to populism. That became a global phenomenon because of the displacement of labor and capital, which was a global issue, right? It was, Brexit. It was Bolsonaro in Brazil. It was yellow vests in France. It was the first Trump administration. And we're seeing it now as well, right? With what's happening in politics today. And so I think leaders need to understand those things. And, one of the biggest challenges of higher education, and we talked about this a little bit before, is I actually think higher education and part of the challenges it's facing, the assault that it's under, is higher education's own doing. I think higher education has completely lost touch with a big portion of society. And we had Cian Blaylock, who is the president of Dartmouth, come to class this year. She's phenomenal. Like, this is a woman who is crazy smart, understands the nuance of these issues, and understands that, she said in class something we had talked about. No one's defending higher education except for people in higher education. We're not a very sympathetic entity. And all of that comes into, how do we make sure we stay connected to people in other parts of the world? How do we stay connected to other parts of our own country? And I think that's what great leaders are going to do today. But I think that's an opportunity. I think that's an opportunity to lead and kind of be that beacon of light and trying to be truly inclusive leaders. That's what I hope people take away from the systems leader.
Well, last question. You work a lot with startups as a venture capitalist, but the other part of your life, you're spending a lot of time talking to senior executives at mature companies, right? Some of which are decades old, and you've worked at companies that, are legacy companies. It used to be that these were considered very, very different domains, right?
Yep.
And if you taught strategy, you didn't teach entrepreneurship and vice versa. But it seems like there is something of a convergence in terms of what it takes to be a good leader, whether you're early stage, late stage, mature stage, legacy, whatever. I mean, and in some sense, that would seem it's easier in a way. It's hard to be a leader, but in some sense, it's easier to the extent that you need to have the same higher level skills regardless of what you're doing. I mean, how has this convergence happened?
It's funny. If that's true, what you just said, that kind of explains and justifies my career. I better to be lucky than good. Back to something we talked about earlier. I worked for some amazing startups. I worked for some amazing large companies. I had wins and losses. I think scalability is a crucial part of what it's going to take for leaders to be successful going forward. And that scalability is critical. And so I think that a lot of the challenges are quite similar. How you apply it in a company of 10 people versus a company of 10,000 people might be a bit different, but the thinking is going to be the same. You're still going to need to understand the impact between different functions in a company, how your company interacts with its ecosystem. You're going to have to understand, how do you manage people with both strength and empathy? How are you going to simultaneously execute and innovate? And so I think there are going to be all sorts of similarities. And I think if one has the ability to go from one to the other, that creates opportunities for leaders in their career. I also just happen to find it fun. Like, I liked working in small companies. I liked working in large companies. I like being an investor. I like being an entrepreneur. I like to think that no matter what setting I go into, hopefully I can bring a bit of empathy, that I understand what the person on the other side is dealing with, because I've been there and I know how hard it is. Most jobs are hard today. And as we talked about at the opening of this chat, if it's getting even harder, hopefully we can bring some kindness to it. And my job is just to help them be better at what they do. And I think that with this constant disruption, people are going to need to be able to be flexible, be aware that it's uncomfortable being flexible. I talk about in the book about the parable of the crab, how crabs, like all crustaceans, need to molt their shells in order to grow. And when they do that, they go from being what was written as vicious predators to soft, paranoid cowards. And I remember reading that and thinking, yeah, that's us. That's humans. But, our shells do grow back when we molt our shells. But when we do molt our shells, it's scary. But that ability to kind of change and be willing to change, and I think acknowledging that it's hard for us and hard for our team, I think if people do that, I think they have the chance of, really kind of getting their organizations and their teams where they need to get to.
Well, Rob, jobs like ours are getting harder and harder, but they're certainly getting more interesting. And I know you are having at least as much fun as I am in this hybrid world. And so I appreciate so much you joining me. The book is called Systems Leader. Check it out. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks so much, Greg. Good to see you again.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.